You're a German soldier in March 1945, watching the Rhine River like it's the last impenetrable line between you and disaster. The bridges have been blown, the engineers are scattered, and the Allies are closing in. But you're calm, confident, even. Because a river this wide, this deep, it's always bought time. You think you'll have weeks. Then, within hours, the Americans are on your side of the river.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
Not because they built a bridge, because they brought trucks that swim. Welcome to one of the biggest military underestimations of World War II, the moment when the German army failed to grasp what mass-produced amphibious trucks could actually do, and paid for it with the collapse of their entire defensive strategy. Between March 23 and 26, 1945, the Allies executed a river crossing so fast, so unexpected, and so logistically overwhelming that it cracked German resistance in just 3 days. And the secret wasn't just planning or bravery, it was industrial pragmatism. It was the DUKW. Or as the troops called it, the Duck. And no, this wasn't some sci-fi miracle vehicle. This was a steel-bodied, 6-wheeled truck that could roll into the water, float like a boat, and roll right back out the other side loaded with supplies, weapons, or troops. Thousands of them. Quietly mass-produced while Germany was still clinging to fantasies of superior engineering saving the day. German intelligence had seen amphibious vehicles before. They'd spotted them during earlier Allied campaigns: Italy, Normandy, southern France. But they thought they were logistical novelties. Support vehicles. Niche equipment. Not game changers. They were wrong. The Rhine was supposed to be the last real natural barrier. Deep, wide, and historically a nightmare for any invading force. Traditional doctrine required weeks of bridge building, pontoon setups, and heavy engineer presence to get across, giving defenders time to regroup and retaliate. That's what the Germans were counting on. But the Americans came prepared. The crossing was a logistics masterpiece. Thousands of amphibious DUKWs were divided into specialized units. Crews were trained extensively to handle river conditions. Support lines were pre-organized. Everything ran like clockwork. Because that's what American war doctrine had become by 1945, a brutal symphony of mass production, planning, and reliable not perfect equipment. The DUKW was the embodiment of that philosophy. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't pretty. But it was reliable, fast to build, and easy to repair. That mattered more than perfection. And when the Americans rolled those DUKWs into the Rhine, something fundamental shifted. The Germans, expecting a drawn-out engineering operation, found themselves flanked within hours. The Allies didn't wait for the right crossing point, they created dozens. Simultaneously, the DUKWs weren't just crossing, they were infiltrating. This wasn't how rivers were supposed to work. The result? Total collapse. German defenses were overwhelmed before they could even recalibrate. Entire strategic and defensive plans became obsolete overnight. Troop movements, artillery placements, fallback positions, none of it mattered when the enemy was already across and pressing forward. Psychologically, it was devastating. The Rhine had long been sold as a natural fortress, a symbol of German resilience. Seeing it breached not by elite paratroopers or engineering miracles, but by what looked like delivery trucks on water, it shattered that illusion. And once that morale broke, the rest followed. The war in Europe had already turned against Germany, but this crossing accelerated its unraveling. Weeks were shaved off the timeline. Infrastructure that might have been destroyed in a longer campaign was preserved. The psychological blow sped up the disintegration of German command. This wasn't just a tactical win. It was a philosophical one. Because the Germans, for all their engineering prowess and doctrinal sophistication, didn't grasp what the Americans had embraced fully by 1945, that modern war wasn't just about strategy and courage. It was about industry. It was about scale, standardization, and practicality. The DUKW wasn't an invention born of genius. It was born of need. America didn't try to reinvent amphibious warfare, it industrialized it. And that was a problem German intelligence simply didn't take seriously. To them, these trucks weren't serious threats. They were support tools, background noise in the real war. And that misjudgment, mistaking logistics for logistics instead of seeing them as tactical weapons, was catastrophic. This kind of conceptual failure is rare. German intelligence wasn't ignorant. It was blind in a very specific way. It didn't miss the trucks. It just didn't believe they mattered. And that's where the American advantage truly showed. Because when you build thousands of vehicles that can roll, swim, and deploy supplies without needing bridges or engineers, rivers stop being barriers. They become highways. And when those rivers are what the enemy depends on for defense, you've effectively erased their map. The Rhine crossing was a perfect storm of innovation, logistics, and brute force efficiency. It proved that the future of warfare wasn't just in tactics, it was in the supply chain, in manufacturing, in boring, pragmatic decisions that didn't win awards but won wars. It also signaled something bigger, that the age of the perfect machine was over. The DUKW didn't need to be elegant, it needed to work. And when enough of them worked, nothing could stop them, not even the Rhine. In the end, the Allies didn't just cross a river, they crossed into a new era of war. One where production lines mattered more than parade formations. One where logistical innovation carried the same weight as battlefield heroism. The DUKW didn't win the war on its own, but it helped end it faster. It showed that industrial power could redefine strategy itself. That a truck with a boat hull could upend years of doctrine. That when you underestimate innovation not because it's secret, but because it seems too simple, you set yourself up for disaster. Germany learned that lesson the hard way in March 1945. And military doctrine hasn't been the same since. If you're into the moments where simple ideas crush overcomplicated assumptions, or when underestimated tools turn the tide of history, you're in the right place. Drop a comment below. What other wartime innovations do you think didn't get the credit they deserved? And if you want more breakdowns of wild military blunders and strategic surprises, hit that subscribe button and share this with your fellow history nerds. Because sometimes the biggest game changers aren't the ones you see coming, they're the ones you completely ignore. Let's be real, if this had been a Hollywood war movie, the Rhine would have been crossed with a climactic bridge explosion, a last-minute sacrifice, and some slow-motion heroics. But what actually brought the Germans to their knees in March 1945 wasn't cinematic. It was clinical, cold, calculated, and deeply, deeply industrial. What broke the German defense wasn't a moment of glory, it was a convoy of steel-bodied duck trucks rolling into the water and coming out on the other side like it was just another delivery route. No explosions. No grand declarations. Just relentless, boring efficiency that turned a weeks-long engineering problem into a 3-day logistical beatdown. And here's the kicker, this wasn't even supposed to be the dramatic centerpiece of the Allied push into Germany. It was one part of the plan. But because German intelligence underestimated it so badly, it became the part that cracked everything wide open. German doctrine had spent years assuming that river crossings would always follow the same playbook: prep, build, bridge, attack. In theory, you could spot it coming. You'd see engineers arrive, watch pontoons go up, wait for the bridgehead to form, and then hammer it with artillery. Predictable, methodical, old school. But when thousands of ducks rolled up and just started crossing en masse with no need to wait for bridges or for engineers to finish building, the Germans had nothing in place to counter it. There was no fallback strategy for what if they skipped the bridge part entirely, because they didn't believe that was possible. Even when the Allies had used ducks in earlier operations, Italy, Normandy, southern France, German planners had filed them away as support tools. Logistical background noise. They didn't realize that the Allies had scaled up production so massively that these novelty trucks were now leading the charge. By the time they figured it out, the Americans weren't approaching the Rhine. They were already across it. It's the kind of miscalculation that seems obvious in hindsight, but it wasn't just a mistake, it was a total systems failure. German command didn't just misread the tool, they misread the doctrine. They believed rivers were permanent barriers, that obstacles were always going to act like they had in the past. But the Americans weren't playing by those rules anymore. That's what happens when a war turns into an industrial contest. The side that can innovate faster and scale wider doesn't just get better tools, they rewrite the rules entirely. The Allies turned the Rhine from a barrier into an afterthought. Because when your army can cross a river in thousands of amphibious vehicles without stopping, your enemy loses more than ground, they lose time. And time, in the final months of World War II, was everything. Let's talk about the numbers. The Allies didn't roll up with a few of these things. They came with thousands of ducks. Entire units were trained specifically to operate them. Every detail was accounted for: supply lines, maintenance crews, spare parts. This wasn't a gimmick, it was a logistical sledgehammer. And while German forces were trying to adjust to the unexpected crossings, the Americans didn't pause. They surged forward, reinforced immediately by those same vehicles, bringing in more troops, more supplies, more fuel. It was a river crossing that didn't need a bridge, and that's what made it unstoppable. You have to understand, this was the moment where American war doctrine built on quantity, speed, and standardization crushed the old European idea of tactical superiority. The myth that better trained, better equipped, more experienced troops could always hold the line just broke. Because those troops were outmaneuvered by trucks. It wasn't that the DUKW was some unbeatable weapon, it was that there were so many of them. They weren't perfect. They didn't need to be. They just needed to work well enough. And in war, well enough, at scale beats perfect, in small numbers every time. The Germans, for all their engineering brilliance, were obsessed with quality, precision machines. Tanks that were technologically superior, but expensive, slow to build, and impossible to repair under pressure. The Americans went the other direction. They built weapons that could be produced by the thousands, repaired with a wrench and some chewing gum, sent out with fresh troops who were trained fast and deployed faster. And when it came time to cross the Rhine, the difference between those two philosophies was crystal clear. German defenses were waiting for a textbook river crossing. What they got was a flood of DUKWs bypassing every rule they were prepared for. There's something almost poetic about how quietly it happened. No iconic image, no burning bridge, just this quiet realization, spreading across the German lines, that the enemy wasn't waiting for the right moment to attack. They were already here, behind you, around you, inside your defensive perimeter. That's the psychological part no one talks about enough. The Rhine wasn't just a military boundary, it was a symbol. The last natural line of defense between Allied forces and the German heartland. The idea that it could be breached without a brutal, drawn-out campaign felt impossible. But the breach came, not with fanfare, but with trucks that floated. The moment the DUKWs started rolling in, that psychological illusion collapsed. And with it, so did morale. The myth of the invincible Rhine didn't die in battle, it drowned under the weight of industrial logistics. This wasn't just a tactical success. It was a strategic humiliation. The Germans had prepared for every traditional kind of river crossing. But not for this. Because this wasn't tradition. It was transformation. After the Rhine crossing, there was no recovery. German forces couldn't regroup fast enough. Their entire timetable was shattered. Units were cut off, infrastructure was bypassed, and resistance crumbled under the speed of the Allied advance. And that's the thing, the Rhine wasn't supposed to fall like this. It was supposed to be a choke point, a place to delay the inevitable. By time. Instead, it ended up accelerating the collapse. It turned into a launch pad, not a defense line. And the legacy of that moment, it didn't end in 1945. What the Allies did at the Rhine, turning logistics into strategy, became the blueprint for post-war military planning. NATO adopted it. Cold War doctrine absorbed it. Amphibious mobility, mechanized infiltration, and logistical supremacy became the foundation of modern warfare. All from a vehicle that looked like a floating lunchbox on wheels. The DUKW didn't just help win a battle. It changed how battles were fought. It proved that in total war, the side with better ideas and the means to mass-produce them holds the true power. Not the one with the flashiest weapons, or the deepest roots in tradition. The Rhine crossing wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. But it was devastatingly effective. And that's what makes it one of the most underrated turning points of the entire war. So the next time you hear about some obscure military tech being dismissed as just support, remember the ducks. Remember how a floating truck blindsided an entire army. And how a war, expected to grind on for weeks longer, was suddenly speeding toward its conclusion because one side refused to fight by the old rules. Here's the part that really stings. Germany didn't lose the Rhine crossing because their soldiers weren't brave, or because their weapons failed. They lost because their entire worldview couldn't keep up. In their mind, the war was still being fought like it was 1940. Battles were decided by elite units, strategic choke points, and carefully engineered defenses. But by 1945, the Allies were playing a different game entirely. They'd industrialized everything. Supply lines, troop movement, even the terrain itself. Rivers, forests, mountains, they weren't obstacles anymore. They were just variables in a spreadsheet. And the DUKW. That was the proof. This weird-looking boat truck hybrid didn't just carry cargo, it carried an entire philosophy. That quantity matters. That good enough at scale beats perfect in theory. That it's not about having the most advanced tank, it's about having 50 trucks that don't need a bridge. When the Allies launched their assault, it wasn't just about crossing the Rhine. It was about showing that the old rules of war didn't apply anymore. And once that realization hit, the Germans were out of time, out of options, and outmaneuvered at every turn. And yet even in the face of this overwhelming force, German command didn't fully grasp what had just happened. They were still looking for the bridge, still waiting for the engineers, still assuming this was some kind of trick. But it wasn't a trick. It was simply logistics, scaled to terrifying efficiency. The duck was kept coming, day and night, rolling in with supplies, rolling back with wounded, bypassing destroyed infrastructure, creating mobile, flexible points of entry across the entire riverfront. You couldn't stop them, because there wasn't one choke point to defend. There were dozens. The Americans had turned the entire Rhine into a wide-open gate. That's the kind of disruption you can't fix with reinforcements or artillery. That's systemic collapse. The moment your doctrine doesn't match reality, you're not fighting a war, you're watching one unravel. And on the Allied side, the confidence was palpable. The Duckles weren't a backup plan. They were the plan. That level of faith in a single piece of equipment says everything about the mindset shift that had taken place. This wasn't about one heroic assault. It was about reshaping warfare through manufacturing, through modular design, through the kind of innovation that doesn't make headlines but makes victory inevitable. And that legacy didn't fade when the war ended. Militaries around the world took notice. Amphibious mobility became a central part of Cold War planning. River crossings were no longer seen as operations that required weeks of build-up. They became standard, expected, built into the flow of modern warfare. Because after the Rhine, everyone understood, if you can move your troops and supplies faster than the enemy can react, you don't need to fight every battle. You just overwhelm them before they know what's happening. The DUKW may not look like a war hero, but it reshaped the battlefield. It's easy to overlook. It's not glamorous. It doesn't have the mystique of a fighter plane or the menace of a heavy tank. But it won something more important than attention. It won time. And in war, time is everything. So when you see old footage of those odd little trucks paddling through water like they're out for a Sunday drive, remember those were the vehicles that shattered the myth of the Rhine, that ended the war faster, that proved a mass-produced and glamorous floating truck could break the spine of an entire military doctrine. That's not just logistics. That's history being rewritten one duck at a time. If this story surprised you, or gave you a new way to look at how wars are really won, hit that like button. Share it with someone who still thinks military power is all about firepower and fancy machines. And drop a comment what's the most underrated vehicle or strategy you think changed history. And of course, subscribe for more deep dives into the chaotic moments where planning, pride, and perception all go up in flames. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's about how completely people can underestimate what's right in front of them.